Have you ever noticed how automatically you answer when someone asks, "Who are you?" Perhaps you say your name, your profession, where you're from, your role as a parent or partner. But underneath this immediate response, something deeper is stirring. A question emerges from the stillness. Is this really who you are? Take one conscious breath now and notice the space in which this question arises. In this moment, you are present to something that cannot be captured in any description, any label, any story about yourself. Yet, most of human life is spent trapped within the confines of these very descriptions, these stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Watch how the mind immediately wants to define, to categorize, to place everything, including yourself, into neat compartments. I am this type of person. I am successful, I am struggling, I am spiritual, I am broken, I am healing. Each statement seems to capture something essential about you, yet each one is also a limitation, a boundary drawn around the limitless. The human being has become so identified with these self-created stories that most people cannot conceive of existence without them. Who would I be without my history? Without my achievements, without my struggles, without my beliefs about myself? The very question can create a kind of existential terror because the mind equates the dissolution of story with the dissolution of self. But notice this moment now. You are here, aware, present, reading these words. This awareness that is aware. Is it your job title? Is it your relationship status? Is it your past trauma or your future dreams? Look directly now. What is it that is aware of all these thoughts about who you think you are? The prison of self-definition is perhaps the most subtle prison of all because the bars are invisible. They are made of thoughts, beliefs, memories, and projections, the pry. Owner and the jailer are the same entity, the mind-made sense of self that has forgotten its true nature. This false self patrols its own boundaries, defending them vigorously against any threat, any suggestion that there might be something beyond the story. Notice how uncomfortable it feels to consider the possibility that you are not your story. The mind immediately protests. But if I'm not my story, then who am I? How will people know me? How will I know myself? What will give my life meaning? These questions arise from a deep misunderstanding about the nature of identity itself. The story of yourself is like a costume you've worn for so long that you've forgotten you can take it off. You've become convinced that you are the costume rather than the one wearing it. But costumes, no matter how beautiful or meaningful, are temporary. They can be changed, discarded, or forgotten. What remains constant is the one who wears them. Take another conscious breath. Feel the aliveness in your body, the awareness behind your eyes, the stillness from which all thoughts arise and into which they dissolve. This is not a story. This is not a description. This is the living reality of what you are before any story is told about you. The invitation is not to immediately abandon all stories about yourself. This would be another form of violence, another kind of force. The invitation is simply to begin recognizing these stories as stories rather than as absolute truth. To notice the difference between what is real and what is imagined, between what is present and what is remembered or projected. In this recognition, a space opens, not an empty space, but a space full of potential, full of presence, full of the mysterious aliveness that you are. The space has always been there, but it has been obscured by the constant noise of self-definition, the endless internal monologue about who you think you are. Watch how this happens. Notice how seamlessly the mind weaves together experiences, thoughts, and emotions into a coherent narrative called my life, my identity, my story. This is the mechanism by which consciousness forgets itself, by which the infinite becomes convinced it is finite, by which the eternal becomes lost in time. The mind is a story-making machine. It cannot help but create narratives to make sense of the flowing, ever-changing nature of experience. This is not wrong. It is simply what minds do. But somewhere along the way, we began to mistake the map for the territory, the story for the reality it attempts to describe. every thought about yourself is a thread in this elaborate tapestry of identity. I am someone who struggles with anxiety. I am someone who helps others. I am someone who has been hurt. I am someone who is seeking enlightenment. Each thread seems necessary, seems to capture something true about your experience, yet the entire tapestry is woven in time, while what you truly are exists beyond time. Notice the constant background narrator in your mind, the voice that comments on your experiences, judges your actions, plans your future, reviews your past. This voice. He speaks as if it knows who you are, as if it has authoritative knowledge about your identity. But when you listen closely, you notice that this voice is itself just another experience arising in the vast space of awareness. The narrator tells stories about the one who is listening, but it is not the one who is listening. The thoughts describe the thinker, but they are not the thinker. The experiences create a sense of an experiencer, but they are not the experiencer. This is the fundamental confusion that creates the prison of self-definition. Take a moment to rest in the space between thoughts. In this space, where is your story? Where is your identity? Where are your problems and your achievements, your past and your future? They exist only when the narrator is active, only when the story-making mechanism is engaged. This does not mean that stories are meaningless or that personality is an illusion to be transcended. It means recognizing stories and personality for what they are, temporary manifestations of consciousness, waves on the ocean of being, dreams within the dream of existence. When you know yourself as the ocean rather than as a particular wave, you can play with form without being imprisoned by it. The mechanism of identification is so automatic, so unconscious, that most people never question it. From earliest childhood, you are taught to identify with form, with your body, your thoughts, your emotions, your roles, your achievements, your failures. This identification becomes so complete that any threat to these forms feels like a threat to your very existence. But watch this mechanism in action. Notice how a single thought can immediately create a sense of self around it. I'm not good enough instantly creates the identity of someone who is inadequate. I'm making progress immediately generates the sense of someone who is evolving. I don't understand this forms the temporary identity of someone who is confused. Each identification is like stepping into a different costume, taking on a different character. But who is it that steps into these costumes? Who is it that observes this constant changing of identity? This observer cannot be any of the identities it observes, just as the screen cannot be any of the movies projected upon it. The mind's addiction to story making runs deeper than most people realize. It is not just that you have stories about yourself. You are constantly living inside these stories, seeing everything through their lens, making decisions based on their logic. The story becomes the filter through which all experience is interpreted. If your story is that you are someone who struggles, then struggle becomes the lens through which you view every situation. If your story is that you are someone who helps others, then everything is seen in terms of how you can be of service. If your story is that you are someone seeking truth, then every experience becomes part of your spiritual journey. Notice this now. What story are you currently living inside? What identity are you unconsciously maintaining? Look not for the obvious stories, but for the subtle ones, the quiet assumptions about who you are that color every moment of your experience. The story feels real because it is reinforced constantly. Every memory that fits the narrative is highlighted. Every experience that confirms the identity is emphasized. Meanwhile, anything that contradicts the story is minimized, forgotten, or reinterpreted to fit the existing framework. This is how the false self maintains itself, through selective attention, through confirmation bias, through the unconscious editing of experience to support a predetermined conclusion about who you are. But this editing happens in awareness, and awareness itself remains untouched by any story told within it. Rest for a moment in this awareness. Notice that it has no stories about itself, It simply is, pure, open, allowing all experiences to arise and dissolve without claiming ownership of any of them. This is what you are before any story begins and after every story ends. Now we begin to see the layers upon layers of accumulated identity, each one feeling absolutely necessary, each one seeming to capture something essential about who you are. There is the cultural layer, the values, beliefs, and assumptions inherited from the society into which you were born. There is the familial layer, the roles and dynamics learned in your first relationships. There is the professional layer, the identity formed around what you do for work. There is the personal layer, the unique combination of experiences and choices that you believe make you who you are. Each layer accumulates gradually, imperceptibly. You do not wake up one day and decide to become identified with your culture, your family role, your profession, your personal history. Instead, these identifications form slowly, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river. Over time, the sediment becomes so thick that you forget there is a river beneath it. The cultural layer often forms the deepest foundation because it begins before conscious memory. You absorb not just the language and customs of your culture, but its fundamental assumptions about reality, about what it means to be human, about what constitutes success, failure, good, and evil. These assumptions become so basic to your worldview that you rarely question them. They simply become the unexamined background against which your life unfolds. Notice how automatically you think in the language of your culture, how naturally you assume its values are universal truths rather than particular perspectives. The cultural identity whispers constantly, "This is how people like us think. This is what people like us do. This is what people like us believe." The identity feels as natural as breathing, yet it is entirely learned. The familial layer builds upon this foundation, creating specific roles and patterns that feel uniquely yours, yet are often passed down through generations. You become the responsible one, the rebel, the mediator, the achiever, the sensitive one. These roles feel like essential aspects of your personality, yet they are often responses to family dynamics that no longer exist. Take a conscious breath and notice. Which family role do you still unconsciously play, even in situations that have nothing to do with your family? How does this role limit your responses, predetermine your reactions, shape your sense of what is possible for you? The professional layer can become particularly consuming because it often provides not just identity but also survival, recognition, and social status. I am a teacher, I am an entrepreneur, I am a mother, I am an artist. The work you do becomes who you are rather than something you engage in. When this identity is threatened through job loss, retirement, or career change, it can feel like a fundamental threat to your existence. But who were you before you had any profession? Who are you in the moments when you are not engaged in your work? Look for the one who remains constant while the professional roles change and evolve. The personal layer might seem the most real because it is built from your unique experiences, your individual choices, your personal journey. I am someone who has overcome trauma. I am someone who values creativity. I am someone who seeks meaning. These identities feel earned, chosen, authentic in a way that cultural and familial identities might not. Yet even these personally chosen identities are constructions, stories told about experiences rather than the experiences themselves. The healing journey becomes an identity rather than a natural unfolding. The creative expression becomes a self-concept rather than a spontaneous emergence. The search for meaning becomes a character in a spiritual story rather than a living inquiry. Notice the weight of carrying all these layers. Feel how much energy it takes to maintain these various identities, to keep track of who you are supposed to be in different situations, to defend these constructions against anything that might threaten them. Each layer has its own set of rules, expectations, fears, and desires. The courage required to question these layers is immense because each one feels like it provides something essential: security, meaning, belonging, purpose. To question them feels like risking everything that gives life structure and significance. Yet this questioning is not about destroying these layers, but about recognizing them as temporary costumes rather than permanent identity. Who would you be without your cultural programming? Not someone from a different culture, but free from the unconscious assumption that any cultural perspective is absolute truth. Who would you be without your family role? Not without the love and connection, but free from the limiting patterns and inherited expectations. Who would you be without your professional identity? Not without skills or contribution, but free from the need to derive your worth from what you do. Who would you be without your personal story of growth, healing, and seeking? Not without the learning and evolution, but free from the identity that forms around these experiences. Rest in this question without trying to answer it. Let the question work on you rather than working on the question. In the space where all these identities dissolve, what remains? Not nothing, but everything. Not emptiness, but fullness. Not the absence of yourself, but the presence of what you have always been beneath every story, behind every layer, beyond every identification. This is the beginning of freedom, not the freedom to become someone else, but the freedom to discover what you are when you are not trying to be anyone at all. There is something deeply revealing about the relationship between our stories and our pain. If you observe closely, you will notice that much of your identity is actually built around suffering, past hurts, ongoing struggles, fears about the future. The mind has a peculiar attachment to pain, not because it enjoys suffering, but because suffering provides such a strong sense of self. Notice how alive you feel when telling the story of something that went wrong, something that was unfair, something that hurt you. There is an intensity there, an aliveness that comes from the emotional charge around these experiences. The pain gives weight to the story, makes it feel real and significant in a way that peaceful moments rarely do. This is what we might call the pain body, the accumulated emotional residue of past suffering that has become part of your sense of identity. It feeds on drama, conflict, and unconscious reenactment of old wounds. It whispers, "This is who you are. This is what happened to you. This is why you are the way you are." The pain body is incredibly intelligent in its survival strategy. It knows that if you fully heal, if you completely let go of the past, then a major part of your identity would dissolve. So it keeps the wounds slightly open, keeps the stories alive, keeps you identified with your suffering in subtle and not so subtle ways. Watch how this operates in your own experience. Notice how certain stories about yourself carry an emotional charge that other stories do not. The neutral facts of your life, what you had for breakfast, the color of your shirt, the route you took to work, these create no sense of identity because they carry no emotional weight. But the stories of betrayal, loss, triumph over adversity, spiritual seeking born from suffering, these create intense identification because they are saturated with emotion. The pain body is not interested in healing in the way you might think. It is interested in being right, in being justified, in having its story validated. It would rather be right about how you were wronged than be free from the story altogether. It would rather maintain the familiar identity of someone who has been hurt than risk the unknown territory of someone who is whole. Take a moment to breathe into this recognition, without judgment, without trying to fix anything. Simply notice how much of your sense of self is built around old pain, how much energy goes into maintaining these painful identities, how reluctant something in you is to let them go completely. The pain body creates what we might call victim narratives, villain narratives, and hero narratives, all of which serve to reinforce the false sense of self. In the victim narrative, your identity becomes organized around what was done to you, how you were hurt, how life has been unfair. In the villain narrative, your identity forms around your mistakes, your regrets, your sense of being fundamentally flawed or wrong. In the hero narrative, your identity crystallizes around overcoming adversity, helping others, or seeking truth, which seems positive, but is still a form of identity based on form rather than being. Each narrative feels completely justified. The victim narrative points to real hurt. The villain narrative acknowledges real mistakes. The hero narrative celebrates real growth and service. The pain body is clever. It doesn't create identities around obviously false stories. It builds them around experiences that really happened, emotions that were really felt, responses that were really necessary at the time. But notice the difference between having an experience and becoming identified with that experience. You can acknowledge that hurtful things happened without making someone who has been hurt your primary identity. You can recognize that you made mistakes without becoming someone who is fundamentally flawed. You can appreciate your growth and service without needing someone who overcomes and helps to be who you are. The emotional charge around these stories is what keeps them alive and seemingly real. Without the emotional investment, they would simply be memories, events that happened in the past rather than living components of present identity. But the pain body feeds emotional energy into these stories, keeps them vivid and immediate, makes them feel more real than the present moment. This is why purely intellectual understanding rarely dissolves these identity patterns. You can understand conceptually that you are not your story, but if the emotional charge remains, the story will continue to feel real and necessary. The dissolution happens not through analysis, but through presence, through bringing conscious awareness to the emotional charge itself until it naturally dissipates. Sometimes people ask, but if I let go of my painful stories, won't I become complacent? Won't I lose my compassion? Won't I forget important lessons? This question arises from the fear that without the pain body's narratives, you will become spiritually bypassed or emotionally numb. But the opposite is true. When you are no longer defending painful identities, you become more present, more responsive, more genuinely compassionate, because your responses arise from being rather than from reactive patterns. The preference for a painful identity over no identity at all reveals something profound about the human condition. The ego would rather suffer and maintain its sense of separateness than dissolve into the peace of being. It would rather be someone who is in pain than risk discovering that there might be no someone at all in the way it imagines. But this fear is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The dissolution of painful identity does not mean the disappearance of you. It means the disappearance of the limitations that have been pretending to be you. It means the end of suffering, not the E, and of existence. It means the beginning of authentic life rather than the death of false life. The gentle approach to this dissolution is through presence rather than force. You do not try to push away painful stories or positive spiritual narratives. You do not attempt to transcend the pain body through effort or technique. Instead, you simply bring conscious awareness to whatever is arising, allowing the light of presence to illuminate these patterns without resistance. In this allowing, something extraordinary happens. The emotional charge begins to dissipate naturally, not because you are trying to get rid of it, but because it cannot maintain itself in the light of conscious awareness. The stories begin to lose their grip, not because you are fighting them, but because they are seen clearly for what they are, movements in consciousness rather than fundamental truths about who you are. Underneath all the narratives of pain and triumph, struggle and overcoming, there is something that has been silently watching, silently aware, silently present throughout every moment of your life. This something has never been hurt, never made a mistake, never needed to overcome anything. It has simply been present, aware, untouched by any story told about it. This is the witness, the aware presence that observes all experiences but is itself untouched by any experience. It watches thoughts without being thoughts. It observes emotions without being emotions. It witnesses stories without becoming identified with any story. This witness is what you truly are, beyond every narrative, beyond every identity, beyond every painful or beautiful experience. The recognition of this witness is perhaps the most important discovery you can make, yet it is not really a discovery at all. It is more like remembering something you have always known, but temporarily forgotten. The witness has been there all along, patiently watching as consciousness became lost in its own creations, compassionately present as awareness identified itself with temporary forms. To recognize the witness, you do not need to go anywhere or achieve anything. You simply need to notice what is already noticing. Right now, as you read these words, something is aware of the reading, something is present to the understanding or confusion, the agreement or resistance that might be arising. What is this something? Take a moment to turn attention back on itself. Notice the awareness that is aware of being aware. This is not another experience to be observed. This is the observer itself. This is not another object in consciousness. This is consciousness recognizing its own nature. The witness is not personal in the way you might imagine. It is not your awareness as opposed to someone else's awareness. It is simply awareness itself, recognizing itself through the temporary focal point you call your life. When you rest in this recognition, the boundaries between self and other begin to soften because you are no longer identified with the particular forms through which awareness is expressing itself. This witness consciousness has been present through every stage of your life. Every change of identity, every transformation of personality, it was there when you were a child, it is here now, and it will be present through whatever changes are yet to come. While everything else changes, this remains constant. While every story evolves, this remains still. From the perspective of the witness, all stories are equally valid and equally illusory. The painful stories and the beautiful stories, the victim narratives and the hero narratives, the spiritual seeking and the worldly ambition, all are simply movements in consciousness, waves on the ocean of being. None of them touch the essential nature of what you are. This recognition brings profound peace, not because your problems are solved or your stories improved, but because you realize you are not fundamentally threatened by any story. You can have experiences without being destroyed by them. You can feel emotions without being defined by them. You can engage with life fully without losing yourself in the drama of personality. The shift from identification with the content of consciousness to recognition of consciousness itself is subtle but revolutionary. It is like the difference between being a character in a dream and recognizing yourself as the dreamer. The character's problems don't disappear, but they are no longer ultimately threatening because you know they are occurring within a larger context of safety and wholeness. Rest in this recognition now. Notice that you are the space in which all experiences arise. You are not the experiences themselves. You are the aware presence that allows all experiences to come and go. In this space, there is room for everything and attachment to nothing. There is unconditional acceptance of what appears and complete freedom from identification with any appearance. When identity begins to dissolve, when the familiar stories about yourself start to lose their grip, something in you might panic. This is natural and understandable. The ego has never known existence without these reference points, these markers of who and what you are. To the mind, the dissolution of identity feels like the threat of annihilation. This fear arises because the ego cannot conceive of existence beyond form, beyond story, beyond the familiar landmarks of personality and history. It assumes that if these structures dissolve, you will cease to exist. But this assumption reveals a fundamental confusion about the nature of existence itself. Watch this fear when it arises. Notice how it feels in the body, how it moves through your energy system, how it generates thoughts about the importance of maintaining your story. Do not try to overcome this fear. Simply be present with it. Let it move through the space of awareness without resistance, without trying to make it go away or stay. The dissolution process rarely happens all at once. More often it occurs in waves, periods of clear recognition of your true nature alternating with periods of renewed identification with familiar patterns. Sometimes you might experience moments of profound freedom, only to find yourself back in old stories a few hours or days late. This is part of the natural rhythm of awakening. Do not judge these apparent setbacks. They are not setbacks at all, but rather the ego's natural process of integration. Consciousness is learning to recognize itself while still engaging with the world of form. This requires a delicate balance, a gradual shift rather than a sudden leap that might shock the system. During periods of dissolution, you might experience a temporary disorientation. The familiar landmarks of identity, your preferences, your motivations, your sense of direction in life might become unclear. This can be unsettling because the mind is accustomed to having clear categories and definitions for everything, especially for yourself. In these periods, it is important to be extraordinarily gentle with yourself. Do not try to force clarity or rush back into familiar identities just to feel secure again. Allow yourself to not know who you are for a while. Rest in the not knowing as a pregnant space rather than as a problem to be solved. This temporary confusion is actually a sign that the dissolution is working. It means that the rigid structures of identity are softening, making space for something more authentic to emerge.
But what emerges is not a new identity. It is the recognition of what you have always been beneath every identity. The void between the old identity and the recognition of your true nature can feel like limbo. You are no longer who you thought you were, but you have not yet stabilized in the recognition of what you actually are. In this space, old decisions might not make sense, familiar motivations might lose their power, and the future might become completely unclear. Breathe into this uncertainty. Let it be okay to not know what comes next. Let it be okay to feel groundless for a while. This groundlessness is not a problem. It is the natural state of being that has been obscured by false certainties and artificial security. The ego wants to rush through this phase, to quickly establish new reference points, new stories, new identities, perhaps more spiritual ones, more conscious ones, but still identities nonetheless. Be patient with this impulse without indulging it. The point is not to become a different someone, but to recognize the one who is aware of all someones. Sometimes, in this process, you might feel like you are losing your motivation, your passion, your sense of purpose. The things that used to drive you might lose their appeal. The goals that used to seem important might feel meaningless. This is not depression. This is discernment. It is the natural result of no longer being driven by unconscious needs for validation, security, or meaning. What emerges from this apparent loss of motivation is not apathy but authentic engagement. Instead of being driven by the ego's needs, you begin to respond from presence itself. Actions arise spontaneously from being rather than from the conditioned patterns of the false self. This might look like less activity, but it is actually more aliveness. The dissolution process requires tremendous patience because it cannot be hurried or controlled. It happens in its own time, in its own way, according to a wisdom that is far greater than the mind's preferences about how awakening should unfold. Your job is not to manage this process, but to trust it, to allow it, to be present with whatever is arising. Self-compassion becomes essential during this time. The ego might judge the dissolution as spiritual failure, as losing ground, as going backward rather than forward. But dissolution is not failure. It is the very heart of awakening. You cannot discover what you truly are without letting go of what you falsely believed yourself to be. Be gentle with the confusion, gentle with the fear, gentle with the resistance that naturally arises when fundamental structures of identity begin to shift. These responses are not obstacles to awakening. They are part of the awakening process itself. Consciousness is learning to recognize itself, and this recognition necessarily involves the dissolution of everything that consciousness is not. What begins to emerge as the old identity structures soften is a completely different way of being in the world. Instead of living from the conditioned patterns of personality, you find yourself responding from presence itself. This is not a new technique to learn or a different way to behave. It is the natural flowering of consciousness when it is no longer filtered through the limitations of a false self.
When you are no longer defending a particular identity, no longer trying to maintain a specific image of yourself, actions arise spontaneously from the stillness of being. There is no internal debate about what the right response should be, no consultation with past patterns or future projections. What needs to happen simply happens, emerging from the intelligence of the moment itself. This spontaneous action might appear less dramatic than the driven behavior of the ego, but it carries a different quality entirely. There is an effortlessness to it, a naturalness that comes from alignment with what is rather than resistance to what is. It is like the difference between a river forcing its way through rocks and a river flowing naturally along its course. Watch how differently creativity flows when it is not filtered through the need to express a particular identity. When you are not trying to be a creative person or produce something that reflects well on your artistic self-image, creativity becomes pure expression. It arises not from the desire to create, but from the fullness of being that naturally overflows into form. Similarly, love transforms when it is no longer an expression of personality, but a recognition of unity. Instead of loving from the need to be loving, to maintain your identity as a caring person, or to get something in return, love becomes the natural response to seeing beyond the surface appearances that seem to separate one being from another. Notice the difference between these two qualities of action. The first arises from thought, from the mind's calculation about what would be appropriate, effective, or beneficial for your image. The second arises from stillness, as from a deeper knowing that does not depend on mental analysis. The first is effortful, the second is effortless. The first maintains separation, the second expresses unity. This shift does not mean becoming passive or withdrawing from life. If anything, you become more present, more available, more responsive to what each moment requires. But your responses come from being rather than from the conditioned reflexes of personality. They arise from wholeness rather than from the fragmented needs of the ego. The freedom to respond rather than react represents perhaps the most practical benefit of living from presence rather than personality. When you are identified with your story, your responses are largely predetermined by the patterns of that story. If your story is that you are someone who has been betrayed, you will react to perceived betrayals. If your story is that you are someone who must succeed, you will react to anything that threatens your success. But when you are resting in presence, each moment is fresh, each situation is met anew. You are not bound by how someone like you should respond. You are free to respond to what is actually happening rather than to your interpretation of what is happening based on old patterns. This does not mean that skills, knowledge, or experience become irrelevant. These remain available as resources that consciousness can draw upon when appropriate, but they are no longer the driving force behind your actions. They become servants of presence rather than masters of personality. Take a moment to feel into this possibility. What would it be like to move through your day without the constant internal narrative about who you are and how you should behave? What would it be like to respond to people and situations from this moment's knowing rather than from yesterday's patterns? The paradox is that by losing the false sense of self, you discover authentic self-expression. When you are no longer trying to be anyone in particular, what you authentically are can finally express itself without interference. This authentic expression is not personal in the way the ego imagines. It is the unique way that universal consciousness expresses itself through the particular focal point of your life. This authentic expression cannot be captured in any description or story because it is alive, dynamic, ever-changing according to what each moment calls forth. It might be fierce or gentle, active or still, engaging or withdrawing, but it always arises from wholeness rather than from fragmentation, from love rather than from fear, from presence rather than from absence. When you are no longer maintaining an identity, relationships transform completely. Instead of relating from story to story, from your narrative of who you are to someone else's narrative of who they are, you begin to relate from being to being. This is perhaps the most profound shift that can occur in human relationships, yet it happens so naturally that you might not even notice it at first. The end of story-based relating means the end of projection. When you are not defending a particular identity, you have no need to make others conform to your expectations of how they should behave toward that identity. You can meet them as they are rather than as supporting characters in your personal drama. Notice how much energy goes into maintaining your image in relationships. The careful presentation of yourself, the subtle manipulation to get others to see you in certain ways, the defensive reactions when they see you differently than you want to be seen. All of this effort is based on the assumption that you are a particular someone who needs to be understood and validated in specific ways. When this need dissolves, an extraordinary intimacy becomes possible. You can be present with others without agenda, without the need to get anything from them or to have them think anything particular about you. This creates space for authentic connection because you are no longer filtering the relationship through the needs of a false self. The fear of intimacy often stems from the fear that if someone really sees you, they will reject the person you are trying to be. But when you are no longer trying to be anyone in particular, this fear becomes irrelevant. There is nothing to protect, nothing to defend, nothing to maintain. You can be completely transparent because there is no false image that transparency might threaten. This does not mean becoming inappropriately intimate with everyone or sharing personal details indiscriminately. It means that your way of being with others arises from presence rather than from the strategic calculations of personality. You naturally respond with whatever level of openness and sharing serves the highest good of each situation. Conflict dissolves in a completely different way when there is no defensive identity to protect. Most arguments are not really about the apparent subject matter. They are about defending competing identities, maintaining positions that feel necessary for psychological survival. When you are not identified with any position, you can engage with disagreement without reactivity. This does not mean becoming agreeable or avoiding necessary confrontation. Sometimes presence calls for very direct, even fierce expression. But this expression arises from clarity rather than from reactivity, from love rather than from fear, from wholeness rather than from the wounded parts of personality that feel threatened. Watch how this works in your own relationships. Notice how much of your emotional reactivity comes from feeling that your identity is being threatened, misunderstood, or invalidated. See how much of your defensive behavior is actually about maintaining a particular image of yourself rather than about addressing the actual situation at hand. When you meet someone from being rather than from personality, you are meeting the same awareness in them that you have discovered in yourself. This recognition might not be conscious on their part, but something in them responds to being seen and met at this level. It often evokes their own deeper nature, drawing them out of identification with their stories and into presence. The recognition of the same awareness in others is what we might call love in its truest sense. It is not the attraction of one personality to another, not the need of one story for another story to complete it. It is the recognition of unity, the seeing through the apparent differences of form to the sameness of essence. This love does not depend on the other person's behavior, does not fluctuate based on whether they are meeting your needs or preferences. It arises from the recognition that at the deepest level there is no other. There is only consciousness, appearing as multiplicity while remaining essentially one. In this recognition, relationships become a celebration rather than a negotiation. Instead of trying to get something from each other, you are simply enjoying the play of consciousness with itself through the apparent forms of separate beings. The relationship serves not the needs of personality, but the joy of being itself. Practical questions often arise. How do you set boundaries when you are not defending an identity? How do you make decisions about relationships when you are not operating from personal preferences? The answer is that wisdom still operates, but it arises from presence rather than from the protective mechanisms of the ego. Boundaries arise naturally from the clarity of the moment, rather than from rigid rules about how people should treat you. You might find yourself saying no very clearly to what does not serve, but without the emotional charge that comes from feeling personally attacked or threatened. You might discover that you naturally gravitate toward relationships that support presence and naturally move away from interactions that reinforce unconsciousness. Rest in the possibility of this quality of relating. Feel what it might be like to be with others without needing anything from them, without trying to maintain any particular image, without defending against any way they might see you. Notice the spaciousness that opens when relationships are no longer burdened by the needs of false identity. The vast freedom that emerges when you are no longer confined to any particular identity is beyond what the mind can imagine while it is still identified. This freedom is not the freedom to do whatever you want. That is still the freedom of personality, albeit less restricted. This is the freedom of being itself, the recognition that you are the space in which all experiences arise rather than any particular experience. When you know yourself as this space, you can play with form without being trapped by it. You can have preferences without being imprisoned by them. You can engage with personality without being limited by it. It is like an actor who can play any role fully while never forgetting that they are not actually the character they are portraying. This freedom brings with it a natural joy that does not depend on circumstances. Not the temporary pleasure that comes from getting what you want, but the inherent aliveness of being itself. This joy cannot be threatened because it does not depend on anything external. It cannot be lost because it is what you are, rather than something. When you stop trying to become enlightened, enlightenment reveals itself as your natural state. When you stop trying to be loving, love flows naturally. This is because these qualities are not achievements of personality, but expressions of being itself. The fear of losing motivation without the driving force of identity reveals how little we trust the intelligence of life itself. But observe nature. Does the flower need to motivate itself to bloom? Does the river need goals to flow toward the ocean? Does the sun need to remind itself to shine? The intelligence that moves the entire universe is the same intelligence that is your true nature. When you align with this intelligence rather than fighting against it with the agenda of personality, everything becomes effortless. Not effortless in the sense of requiring no energy, but effortless in the sense of flowing with the natural movement of life rather than against it. Rest in this recognition now. Feel the aliveness that moves your heart, that breathes your breath, that thinks your thoughts. This is not something you control. This is what you are. This intelligence needs no improvement, no development, no spiritual practice to make it more than it already is. The freedom of formless identity is the freedom to serve life rather than serving the limited agenda of personality. But this service does not feel like sacrifice because you are no longer serving something separate from yourself. You are serving the wholeness of which you are an expression. It is like the wave serving the ocean by being fully itself. This service arises naturally without effort or decision. You find yourself naturally drawn to what supports the awakening of consciousness, naturally aligned with what serves the highest good, naturally responsive to what each moment requires, not because you should, but because this is what consciousness does when it recognizes itself. All of this might sound abstract, like beautiful philosophy that has little to do with the practical realities of daily life, but the integration of this understanding into ordinary existence is where the true test lies. How do you live from this recognition while still engaging with a world that operates largely from story-based identity? How do you maintain your center while dealing with people who are still deeply identified with their narratives? The answer is not to withdraw from the world, but to engage with it more fully, but from a different place. You continue to play your various roles, parent, partner, professional, friend, but you no longer confuse these roles with who you are. You wear them lightly, like costumes in a play, knowing that they are temporary expressions rather than permanent definitions. In practical terms, this means that you can be fully present in your work without deriving your worth from your achievements. You can love your family deeply without needing them to validate your identity as a good parent or partner. You can engage with challenges and difficulties without making them part of your story about yourself. The ongoing practice, though it is not really a practice in the conventional sense, is simply returning to presence whenever you notice yourself getting caught in old patterns of identification. This returning is not a technique but a recognition, not an effort but a relaxation into what you already are. Sometimes this returning happens dozens of times in a single day. You might find yourself completely identified with worry, frustration, or ambition, only to suddenly remember the space in which all these experiences are arising. This remembering is itself a gift, not a personal achievement, but grace appearing in the form of awareness. Be patient with the apparent inconsistency of this process. One moment you might be resting in profound peace, recognizing yourself as pure awareness. The next moment you might be completely lost in the drama of personality, reacting from old patterns as if nothing has changed. This is natural and temporary. Consciousness is learning to recognize itself while still engaging with the world of form. The humility to recognize that awakening is not a permanent state but a continuous returning is essential. The ego would love to make awakening into another achievement, another identity to maintain. Someone who is enlightened, someone who has gotten it. But true awakening includes the recognition that there is no one to get anything and nothing to be gotten. Each moment offers a fresh opportunity to return to what you are. Each breath is an invitation to rest in presence. Each interaction is a chance to respond from being rather than from personality. There is no graduation from this, no final achievement that makes the returning unnecessary. The service that naturally arises from this recognition is not something you do, but something you are. Your very presence becomes the invitation for others to remember their own true nature, not through making or teaching, though those might happen, but simply through being authentically yourself, which is to say, through being presence itself expressing as the unique focal point of your life. This service happens through your way of listening, your quality of attention, your natural responsiveness to what each moment requires. It happens through the peace you carry, the love you embody, the freedom you express. It happens not because you are trying to serve, but because presence naturally serves itself. As we come to rest in this exploration, let yourself feel the truth that has been quietly humming beneath every word, every recognition, every invitation to presence. You are not who you think you are. You are not your story, your identity, your accumulated history of triumph and struggle. You are the aware presence in which all stories arise and dissolve, the eternal stillness that gives birth to all movement, the formless source from which all forms emerge and into which they return. This is not a concept to understand, but a reality to embody, not a teaching to believe, but a truth to live. In this very moment, as these words reach you, you are this presence. You have always been this presence. You will always be this presence, regardless of what stories unfold, what identities come and go, what experiences arise and dissolve in the field of your being. The invitation is simply to rest here in what you are, beyond all labels, beyond all definitions, beyond all attempts to capture the mystery of existence in the small container of personality. Rest in the boundless space of being that you are, letting all stories be held gently in this space without grasping, without resistance, without the need to be anyone at all. In this resting, you discover that you have never been separate from what you have been seeking. You have never been broken in need of fixing, lost in need of finding, incomplete in need of fulfillment. You are already whole, already free, already the peace and love and joy you have been longing for throughout your entire search. Let this recognition settle into the cells of your body, into the quiet spaces between thoughts, into the stillness that is always present even in the midst of the most turbulent experiences. You are this stillness, you are this peace, you are this love that has no opposite, this awareness that knows no boundaries, this being that needs nothing to be complete. Rest here now, beyond every story, beyond every label, in the simple truth of what you are.